Hi guys, welcome to my vlog. Thanks for stopping by today to listen to this discussion. I apologise in advance if you see me looking down because I got notes, just so I remember everything that I want to say. It's pretty hard to remember everything off by heart. So again, sorry if you see me looking down every now and then. Today I just want to run through a discussion on Galatians 1 verses 6 to 10. It's quite a short discussion, but it's quite fiery too, so it'll be interesting to see what we think at the end of it. We'll run through the reason Paul wrote the letter, who he was writing to, and how they would have received it back then. The letter to the Galatians has been widely accepted by scholars to be written around 50 AD. Paul planted this church in Galatia, and then he had to leave them to go plant churches somewhere else. But when Paul left regions, he kept in contact with the churches that he planted by writing these letters, and one of these letters is to Galatians. But between Paul leaving the Galatian church and writing the letter, another group came along called the Jewish Christian missionaries, and they told the Galatian Christians that Paul only gave them half the information needed to be a Christian. They said, yes, you do need to believe in Jesus, but you also need to obey the Mosaic law, keeping the Sabbath, celebrating the Jewish festivals, and most importantly that the men needed to be circumcised. It is thought that the reason why the Jewish missionaries did this was they were trying to protect their heritage identities of being the children of God. When we read Galatians, we need to try and understand the emotions Paul put into the letter and why he was feeling so angry at the Galatians. It comes across as a heated argument, and we need to read it the way that it comes across. Again, the beginning of the passage that we're about to read definitely comes across as a heated argument, and it comes across that Paul was angry when he was writing this passage. And this is how we need to read it. We can't just read it all happy in our head without realizing that the emotion Paul put into this letter should come across in how we read it. So let's read it out loud together so that we can get it. Verse 6 and part of verse 7 says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. So the most important question we need to ask out of this verse is, what is the true gospel Paul is referring to? The gospel message shows us that Jesus loves us so much more than we could ever think of or hope for, even though we are more evil than we ever want to believe. Tom Wright states that for Paul, the gospel is Jesus is lifted up above the whole world, and is starting a worldwide single family with both Jews and Gentiles alike. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart put it this way: grace plus nothing equals favour with God. If we follow this short explanation of the gospel, we begin to understand what a different gospel might look like. So the gospel that the Jewish Christian missionaries were preaching included grace, but instead of it being grace plus nothing, they were adding the Jewish customs, which meant that the Jewish gospel was grace plus law equals favour with God, instead of grace plus nothing. This fundamental difference is why Paul was so angry that the Galatian Christians were so deserting the original gospel that he preached to them and were accepting this new one that the Jewish Christian missionaries were saying. This could be applied to our lives today and to the church that we attend. Are we deserting the real gospel that was preached all those years ago and that we first believed in for a different one? Or are we following the gospel that Tim Keller, Tom Wright, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart so accurately described? These thoughts are crucial for all Christians at all times in their lives to keep remembering and to keep thinking about. Let's continue with our passage. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. This verse seems to suggest that Paul is retracting slightly from accepting that there are two different gospels, and that there is just one true gospel and the rest are just perverting that one. It seems that the Jewish Christian missionaries were perverting the one true gospel instead of preaching a different one. It suggested that the reason Paul was questioning these Jewish Christian missionaries was he was questioning their theology rather than their sincerity. So once again, as Christians today, we need to be conscious of the theology we believe and follow, and make sure that we are following the orthodox, true gospel. There are two reasons why I think this needs to be true: so that we ourselves do not pervert the gospel of Christ, that we preach, teach, and live, and so that we can distinguish between the perversion and the correct teachings of that same gospel. David Dockery writes in an article that there are various messages, contemporary universalistic tendencies, cults, and other heretical views that are worldwide today. And they are not different gospels, but they are a perversion of the one true gospel. So as you can see, the gospel can be easily perverted. And we need to make sure that we are following the one true gospel and not following a perversion of that. Paul continues in verse 8. But even if we or an angel from heaven shall preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than the one you accepted, let them be under God's curse. That's a pretty hard verse to listen to, and you would hope that it's not directed at you. And it's hard not to see Paul's passion for the one true gospel after reading that verse. He is telling the Galatians that even if he himself, or if others like him, or even angels who live in heaven, preach a gospel other than what has already been preached to them, that the Galatian Christians should not be persuaded by it. Paul wants to stress this point so strongly that he backs it up twice, so that the Christians get it, and hopefully we do. If anyone preaches a gospel other than the one that has already been preached, let them be under God's curse. And that's not a light statement, and I don't think any of us want to be under God's curse. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says, being under God's curse is being eternally condemned. Could you imagine being eternally condemned for preaching a different gospel other than the true one that we all believe? If that doesn't scare us into making sure we are preaching and teaching the one true gospel, then I don't know what will. Paul goes on in verse 10. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I was still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul's questions in this verse follows on from the previous one. It follows on from preaching the one true gospel. It becomes clear then that Paul associates preaching the one true gospel with pleasing God, and if we preach a different gospel, then we are trying to please people. And if Paul was trying to please people, then he wouldn't be following what God had commissioned Paul to do, which was to preach the one true gospel of Christ. And then, as Paul said in the last part of the verse, he is suggesting that if he is still trying to please people, then he is doing a disservice to Christ instead of being his servant. So evaluating this verse must show us that preaching the gospel should not be done without first educating ourselves on what the one true gospel is. And for us as Christians to be good servants of Christ, we need to make sure that we understand what the one true gospel is, and we need to educate ourselves so that we are preaching the one true gospel and not perverting it. So should we follow Paul's example by insisting that we please God rather than please people? I think we would all agree that the answer is yes. And if we do believe that, then how then do we make sure we are preaching, teaching, and living the one true gospel? It's quite a tough question, but it's one that we need to ask and continue to think about so that we can begin to understand more of what we need to do. In conclusion then, we can see from this passage that the Galatian Christians were having some trouble with some missionaries who were perverting the true gospel. And what made Paul angry was that these Christians were deserting the one true gospel that they were originally taught for this new persuasive one. As we said with David Dockery, it becomes clear to us today that we still have the same problems with all the cults and the heretical views that are circulating in our world. Sorry, I'm not talking very well, am I? So ultimately as Christians, we must ensure we educate ourselves and we understand what the one true gospel is, so that when we preach, teach and live it, we do it with sincerity and with a good sound theology. It doesn't seem likely that we would want to pervert the gospel willingly. However, with the accuracy that we've already spoken about, with the heresies that circulate. There is definite proof that the perversion has happened and is continuing to happen, and we need to be aware of it and adept to learn how we can understand these and understand where the perversion is. So to finish this vlog off, let's set a challenge for ourselves that we do learn and that we do understand and we do educate ourselves on what the one true gospel is. And we can do this with our friends and family who can critique us to make sure that we are all getting this right. So that when the opportunity comes to talk to non-Christians, whether they're friends, family, or just people in general, that we know that we are preaching and teaching the one true gospel rather than a perverted one. This not only helps them, but it also helps us on our own journey of faith, so that we are living in the one true gospel and that we understand Jesus' love for us. Guys, thanks for stopping by and listening. I hope that this discussion has helped you learn something as much as it's helped me learn, even though I'm the one writing it and talking it. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments you want to leave, please leave it in the comment box below, and it would help me to understand what you guys think and how well I've done. Hopefully I've done well, and hopefully we can all keep the discussion going and have a debate that is friendly and that we can all keep learning. Thanks again, guys. We'll see you next time.